The sky above Arathis Prime was a constant bruise, streaked with shades of ash and rust. It loomed low, pressing down on the remnants of the city, where shattered spires jutted out of the ground like broken teeth. The air tasted metallic, laced with the faint acidity of chemical fallout. Somewhere in the distance, the Warden's war machine stood as an unyielding monument to the Orderer's rule, its silhouette casting an oppressive shadow over what remained of the city's skyline. Elias Ryn crouched behind a crumbling barrier, his pulse steady despite the chaos surrounding him. The sharp crack of plasma fire echoed through the ruins as his team skirmished with one of the Orderer's patrol units. Elias raised his head just enough to glimpse their adversaries, 6 enforcers clad in black armor, their movements unnervingly fluid, almost inhuman. "Ryn, they're flanking us," hissed Dara, her voice tight with urgency as she fired off a shot. The bolt struck one of the enforcers square in the chest, but the armor absorbed the impact. The enforcer turned its faceless helmet toward them, and Elias felt a cold wave of dread. He'd seen these units in action before. They were augmented, their human forms enhanced with alien biotechnology scavenged from the depths of the galaxy. They didn't tire, didn't falter, and didn't stop until their targets were eliminated. "Hold your ground," Elias barked. "Kyle, get that charge ready. We're pulling out in 2 minutes." Across the rubble-strewn street, Kyle was hunched over a cylindrical device, his trembling hands working furiously to prime the explosive. "Almost there," he shouted, though his voice betrayed his panic. Elias scanned the battlefield. 2 of their own were down, one lying motionless, the other writhing in agony with a plasma burn that had melted through his suit. There was no time for recovery. If they didn't finish the mission now, the enforcers would call for reinforcements, and none of them would make it out alive. "Kyle, now!" Elias roared. The explosive detonated with a thunderous boom, sending shockwaves through the ruins and shattering the enforcers' formation. The rebels used the chaos to retreat, weaving through the debris until they reached their extraction point, a rusted transport skiff hidden beneath layers of camouflage netting. As the skiff roared to life and lifted off, Elias slumped into a seat, his chest heaving. He glanced at Dara, whose helmet visor was cracked but intact. "How many did we lose?" "2," she replied grimly, "and we're out of medical supplies. If we don't find a way to resupply soon, the next mission could be our last." Elias didn't respond. He stared out of the skiff's viewport as the city shrank below them, his mind racing. The Orderer's grip on the galaxy was tightening, and the Resistance was fraying under the strain. Every mission felt like a desperate gasp for air in a sea that refused to let them rise. Hours later, back at their hidden base, a subterranean warren carved into the ruins of an abandoned industrial complex, Elias gathered his remaining fighters for a debrief. The room was dimly lit, the air damp and heavy with the scent of oil and rust. A map of the sector was projected onto the wall, its surface marked with glowing red dots representing the Orderer's forces. "We can't keep this up," Kyle said, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Every time we strike, they hit back twice as hard. If we don't find a way to turn the tide, we're done." "We already know that," Dara snapped. "What's your solution? Surrender. Beg the Orderer for mercy." "Enough," Elias interjected, his tone firm but measured. "We all knew what we signed up for. The question isn't whether we can keep fighting, it's how we fight smarter." As if in answer, the comm console crackled to life. Static filled the room, followed by a distorted voice. Shattered blades, this is a secure transmission. Do not respond. Coordinates are attached. Follow them and you will find what you need to end the Orderer's reign. The rebels exchanged wary glances. A trap? Dara asked. Maybe, Elias admitted. But if it's not, this could be the break we've been waiting for. Kyle, run a trace on the signal. See if you can pinpoint its origin. Kyle nodded and set to work, his fingers flying over the console. Minutes later, he looked up, his expression grim. The signal's legit, but it's old. Pre-orderer tech, at least a century out of date. And the coordinates point to Dalrex 7 Dara. Let out a low whistle. Dalrex 7? That place is a graveyard. Toxic atmosphere, uncharted terrain, and crawling with the Orderer's patrols. If the signal's legit, why send us there? Because no one else would be crazy enough to go, Elias said. He studied the map, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. We don't have another option. If there's even a chance this lead is real, we have to take it. The room fell silent as the rebels absorbed his words. Finally, Dara spoke. If we're doing this, we need to be ready. Supplies, weapons, and whatever intel we can scrape together. We can't afford another screw-up. Elias nodded. Agreed. We leave in 48 hours. Rest while you can. It's going to be a long journey. As the others dispersed, Elias lingered by the console, staring at the flickering coordinates on the screen. Dalrex 7. The name sent a shiver down his spine, though he couldn't say why. The Orderer's grip on the galaxy was unrelenting, and every instinct told him this mission was a gamble they couldn't afford to lose. But deep down, in the quiet part of his mind, he rarely acknowledged. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far worse than a trap. The flickering coordinates seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and Elias felt the first stirrings of unease. The wastelands of Dalrex 7 stretched endlessly before them, a barren expanse of jagged terrain coated in a sickly greenish haze. The air was unbreathable without their pressurized suits, laden with toxic gases that warped the environment into an unrecognizable alien hellscape. The ruins of long-forgotten structures jutted out of the ground like skeletal remains, their surfaces eroded by centuries of corrosive winds. Every step Elias and his team took was accompanied by the crunch of brittle ground and the faint hum of their suit compressors. Their target lay miles ahead, an ancient vault buried beneath the wasteland. The coordinates pulsed steadily on Elias's wrist display, a faint beacon in a world otherwise devoid of life. Tension hung heavy among the rebels. They had all heard the stories of Dalrex 7, of scavengers who ventured too deep and returned raving or not at all. Keep your eyes open, Elias said, his voice crackling over the comms. This place isn't as empty as it looks. Yeah, no kidding, muttered Kyle, the engineer, as he adjusted the settings on his scanning device. I'm picking up weird readings. Heat signatures, but they're faint. Could just be residual energy from the vault, or something else. Let's hope it's the first one, Dara replied. She tightened her grip on her plasma rifle, her gaze scanning the horizon. I don't want any surprises. They trudged on for hours, the terrain growing increasingly treacherous. Sharp, crystalline formations jutted from the ground, some pulsing faintly with an inner light. The rebels moved cautiously, careful not to disturb the alien growths. As they neared the coordinates, the crystalline formations became denser, forming a jagged forest that glowed with an eerie, bioluminescent green. The light cast twisted shadows across the team, making them appear like specters moving through the fog. Finally, they reached the vault. It was a massive structure, half buried in the toxic soil, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The entrance was a heavy circular door, its edges lined with alien glyphs that pulsed faintly in sync with the beacon. "This is it," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped forward, his gloved hand brushing against the door's surface. It was warm to the touch, as though it were alive. Kyle knelt by the door, pulling out his tools. "This locking mechanism isn't like anything I've seen before," he said, his voice tinged with both awe and frustration. "Give me a few minutes." Minutes stretched into an agonizing hour as Kyle worked, sweat dripping down his brow despite the cooling system in his suit. The others stood guard, their weapons at the ready. The wasteland around them was unnervingly silent, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. Finally, with a sharp hiss, the door slid open, revealing a dark tunnel that seemed to descend endlessly into the ground. "Great," muttered Dara. "Just what I always wanted, a trip into the abyss." They ventured inside, their helmet lights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The walls of the tunnel were lined with strange organic textures that glistened faintly under their lights. The deeper they went, the warmer it became, the air within their suits growing heavy despite the filtration systems. At the tunnel's end, they found the chamber. It was vast, its domed ceiling covered in the same shifting glyphs as the vault's exterior. At the center stood the relic, a crystalline structure about the size of a man, its facets shimmering with an otherworldly light. Surrounding it were what looked like long-dead organic growths, withered vines and bulbous, shriveled pods that seemed frozen in time. "That's it," Elias said, his voice tinged with awe. He approached the relic cautiously, every instinct screaming at him to be wary. "Kyle, get the containment case ready." As they worked to extract the relic, a low hum began to resonate through the chamber. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder, vibrating in their chests. The walls seemed to ripple, the organic textures shifting like they were waking up. Guys," Dara said, her voice tight with unease. "I think we should hurry." Elias grabbed the relic, its surface unnervingly warm under his gloves. The moment it left its pedestal, the hum turned into a deafening roar, and the chamber came alive. The withered growths around them began to bloom, their pods splitting open to reveal writhing masses of flesh and tendrils that pulsed with a sickly light. "What the hell is that?" Kyle shouted, stumbling back as one of the tendrils lashed out toward him. "Move!" Elias roared, clutching the relic as he led the charge back toward the tunnel. The walls themselves seemed to close in, the organic textures extending into grasping appendages. The team fired their weapons, the plasma bolts searing through the tendrils. But for every one they destroyed, 2 more took its place. As they neared the exit, Kyle cried out in pain. Elias turned to see him clutching his stomach, his suit ruptured and his flesh already darkening with necrotic veins. I don't feel..." Kyle's words trailed off as his body convulsed violently. "Leave him," Dara screamed, pulling Elias forward. "He's gone." Elias hesitated, guilt wrenching at him, but there was no time. He turned and ran, the sounds of Kyle's screams echoing in his ears as they burst out of the vault and into the wasteland. Behind them, the vault's entrance collapsed, a cloud of dust and debris billowing outward. They didn't stop running until they reached the skiff. As they climbed aboard, Elias turned to look back. The crystalline forest was alive now, its pulsing light spreading outward in waves. He could still hear the hum, even through the skiff's reinforced hull. Inside, Elias placed the relic in the containment case, his hands trembling. "What the hell did we just unleash?" he muttered. No one had an answer. They sat in silence as the skiff lifted off, the wasteland below them fading into the toxic haze. But in the pit of his stomach, Elias knew they had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. The skiff sliced through the toxic skies of Dalrec 7, its engines groaning under the strain of the relentless winds. Inside, silence reigned. Elias sat in the pilot's seat, his grip on the controls tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside him, Dara methodically checked her weapon, her movements mechanical, her expression locked in a grim mask. The containment case holding the relic rested between them, its faint hum an unwelcome reminder of the chaos they'd barely escaped. "Anything on the scanner?" Elias asked, his voice breaking the uneasy quiet. "Nothing definite," Dara replied. "Just more of those strange heat signatures. They're faint but moving, circling us." "Could be wildlife," Elias said, though he didn't believe it. Nothing about Dalrec 7 suggested it should harbor life, not the kind that moved. Behind them, the remaining rebels huddled in the cramped cabin. No one spoke. Kyle's absence was palpable, his screams still echoing in their minds. Elias had barely glanced at his team since the vault. He couldn't bring himself to face the weight of their losses. The mission was what mattered. It was all that mattered. The scanner let out a sharp ping, and Dara stiffened. "Elias, those heat signatures. They're getting closer. Fast." "How fast?" "Fast enough," Dara said, gripping her rifle. A loud clang reverberated through the skiff, shaking its hull. The rebels jumped to their feet as another impact followed, this one harder, making the entire vessel shudder. "They're on us," one of the rebels shouted. Elias yanked the controls, throwing the skiff into an erratic dive. Through the viewport, he caught a glimpse of something, an amorphous dark shape clinging to the side of the vessel. Its form seemed to writhe and shift, tendrils of flesh latching onto the metal like roots, burrowing into soil. "Get it off!" Elias barked. Dara was already moving. She unlatched the cabin door, bracing herself against the wind and the toxic atmosphere, and fired her rifle. Plasma bolts slammed into the creature, burning through its outer layer, but it didn't recoil. Instead, it split open, revealing an array of jagged, glistening teeth arranged in concentric rows. It emitted a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the skiff's hull. "It's not working!" Dara shouted, firing again. "Brace yourselves!" Elias yelled, jerking the controls hard to the left. The skiff banked sharply, throwing everyone off balance. The sudden maneuver dislodged the creature, sending it tumbling into the wasteland below. For a brief moment, the cabin fell silent, save for the labored breathing of its occupants. "Is it gone?" one of the rebels asked, her voice trembling. Dara didn't answer. She stared out of the open cabin door, her rifle still raised. "For now," she said finally, slamming the door shut. "But it's not the only one. They're out there." Elias didn't doubt her. Whatever they had unleashed in the vault wasn't confined to that place. The crystalline growths, the tendrils, the things that had once been Kyle, this was all connected, tied to the relic they now carried. The skiff lurched again, and the engine let out a sputtering groan. Elias glanced at the console, his heart sinking as a red light blinked on. "We've got a leak. Damaged fuel line." "How far to the extraction point?" Dara asked. "Too far," Elias said. "We'll have to set down and patch it up." "Set down where?" one of the rebels asked, panic creeping into his voice. "This place is a death trap." "We don't have a choice," Elias snapped. "Everyone gear up. We're not staying long." He brought the skiff down in a clearing surrounded by jagged rock formations. The moment they landed, the team sprang into action. Elias and one of the mechanics worked on the fuel line while Dara and the others formed a perimeter, their weapons trained on the wasteland. The air outside was thick and suffocating, the haze swirling like a living thing. It wasn't long before the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the hiss of the wind, but they grew steadily louder, a chorus of fragmented voices speaking in a language none of them understood. The rebels exchanged uneasy glances, their grips tightening on their weapons. "Elias," Dara said over the comms, "you hearing this?" "Yeah," Elias replied. "Stay sharp." The whispers were accompanied by movement in the haze, dark shapes that flickered at the edges of their vision. One of the rebels fired a warning shot, the plasma bolt disappearing into the fog. For a moment, the whispers stopped, and the wasteland fell silent. Then the ground erupted. The creatures emerged in a frenzy, their grotesque forms moving with impossible speed. They were an amalgamation of flesh and bone, their bodies warped and asymmetrical, as though pieced together by a deranged mind. Tendrils lashed out, dragging one of the rebels into the haze before he could even scream. "Open fire!" Dara shouted. The perimeter erupted in chaos as the rebels fought desperately to hold the creatures back. Plasma bolts seared through the air, but for every creature they killed, two more seemed to take its place. The things moved like a swarm, their bodies twisting and contorting as they closed the distance. "Elias, we're outnumbered," Dara yelled, her voice crackling over the comms. "Just hold them off a little longer," Elias shouted back, his hands moving frantically as he sealed the fuel line. "Almost there." One of the creatures broke through the line, lunging at Elias. He barely managed to duck as its tendrils swiped at his head. Dara fired, the bolt striking the creature in the side and sending it sprawling. "Move, Ryn," she shouted. Elias didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled back onto the skiff, shouting for the others to follow. Dara was the last to board, firing one final shot before slamming the door shut. The creatures clawed at the skiff's hull as it lifted off, their guttural cries echoing in the rebels' ears. As the skiff ascended, Elias collapsed into the pilot's seat, his hands trembling. He glanced at the containment case, its hum now louder than ever. The relic's glow had intensified, casting ominous shadows across the cabin. "What's happening to it?" Dara asked, her voice low. "I don't know," Elias admitted, "but whatever it is, it's not over." Through the viewport, the wasteland stretched endlessly below them, a sea of jagged rock and pulsing green light. In the distance, more dark shapes moved, converging toward their path. Elias gritted his teeth and pushed the skiff's engines to their limit. There was no outrunning what they had awakened, but they had to try. The freighter was falling apart. Smoke filled the cabin, and the air filters struggled to keep the atmosphere breathable. Sparks rained down from shattered control panels as Elias fought the controls, his knuckles white against the cracked yoke. The relic's containment case sat beside him, vibrating violently, its hum a deafening crescendo that threatened to drown out every other sound. "They're still coming!" Dara's voice cut through the chaos, laced with desperation. She was in the rear compartment, firing at the swarm of creatures clinging to the ship's hull. Through the viewport, Elias could see them, twisted masses of flesh and bone, crawling over the freighter like ants. Their glowing, fissured skin pulsated in time with the relic's light, as if drawn to its energy. "Hold them off as long as you can," Elias shouted, though he knew it was futile. The creatures didn't tire. They didn't stop. They were the galaxy's forgotten guardians, bound to the relic by some ancient and incomprehensible purpose. And they weren't the only threat. Through the fractured cockpit glass, Elias glimpsed the war machine descending from the toxic clouds. It was impossibly vast, a leviathan of metal and flesh, its towering spires bristling with weapons and conduits that pulsed with alien energy. The hum of its engines was low and resonant, shaking the freighter to its core. The Warden had come. "Dara, get back here," Elias yelled. "We can't fight them and that thing at the same time." Dara stumbled into the cockpit, her face pale and streaked with blood. She slammed the door shut behind her and leaned against it, gasping for breath. "We've got maybe a minute before they breach. What's the plan?" Elias didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the war machine, its silhouette growing larger with every passing second. It wasn't just a vessel, it was a monument to the Orderer's dominion, a grotesque fusion of technology and organic matter, its surface writhing with tendrils that seemed to pulse with life. The relic was the key. He didn't know how he knew. It wasn't logic, it wasn't reason. It was a primal certainty, an instinct born of the relic's incessant hum and the way it seemed to respond to the war machine's presence. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense, but it was connected to the Orderer's power in a way Elias didn't fully understand. "I'm going to activate it," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Dara's head snapped toward him. "What? Are you insane? You saw what happened back at the vault? This thing doesn't help. It destroys." "It's our only shot," Elias said, meeting her gaze. "The Warden isn't here for us. It's here for the relic. If we can overload it, maybe..." "Maybe what?" Dara interrupted. "Maybe we all die a little faster." "Maybe we stop this," Elias said quietly. "For good." Dara stared at him, her expression a mix of anger and fear. But she didn't argue. She knew as well as he did that there was no other option. The war machine fired its first shot. A beam of searing light sliced through the freighter's hull, ripping away an entire section of the ship. The cockpit shuddered and alarms blared as oxygen levels dropped. The creatures outside shrieked, their forms burning in the beam's wake, but still they came, clawing their way toward the relic. Elias grabbed the containment case and set it on the console. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing the release mechanism. The case hissed open, and the relic's light flooded the cabin, blinding and searing. It pulsed violently, its hum now a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very fabric of reality. The creatures froze. For the first time, they hesitated, their twisted forms convulsing as if in agony. The war machine, too, seemed to falter. Its tendrils recoiled and its weapon systems flickered. The relic's light was affecting them both, as if it were tearing at the bonds that connected them. Elias reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the relic's surface. The heat radiating from it was unbearable, but he didn't pull back. "Get to the escape pod," he said. his voice barely audible over the chaos. "No," Dara said firmly. "I'm not leaving you." "Dara?" "Shut up, Elias," she snapped. "If this is how it ends, we end it together." Before he could argue, the war machine retaliated. Another beam of light tore through the freighter, and the cockpit was engulfed in flames. Elias screamed as the relic's light intensified, piercing through the fire and the smoke, reaching for the war machine like a living thing. The relic pulsed one last time and everything stopped. The creatures disintegrated, their forms unraveling into streams of black ash that were swept away by the wind. The war machine convulsed, its tendrils thrashing as its spires began to collapse inward. The light from the relic consumed everything, and for a brief moment there was silence. When Elias opened his eyes, the cockpit was gone. He was floating in a void, the relic's light surrounding him. Dara was beside him, her face calm despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I guess this is it," she said softly. Elias nodded. He felt no fear, only a strange sense of peace. The relic had done its work. The war machine was gone, and with it, the Orderer's reign. But the cost had been everything. As the light grew brighter, Elias closed his eyes. He thought of the rebels who had fought and died for this moment. He thought of Kyle, of the faces of those who had placed their hope in him. And he thought of Dara, who had stayed by his side until the end. When the light faded, there was nothing left. No freighter, no relic, no war machine. Only silence and the faint echo of a hum that had shaped the galaxy's fate. The Warden was gone, but so was the rebellion. And as the galaxy turned, indifferent and vast, the sacrifice of Elias Ryn and his crew became one more story lost in the endless void.